uncovering the mysteries of Abraham Lincoln's death and aftermath. Have you ever wondered if we truly know the whole story of Abraham Lincoln's death? We all know John Wilkes Booth pulled the trigger, but the mysteries that followed are stranger than fiction. Missing diary pages, vanished body parts, repeated coffin openings, and conspirators who died under eerie circumstances. Were these accidents, or was someone hiding the truth? Tonight, we'll uncover the secrets behind Lincoln's assassination and the strange events that followed. Stick with us, because the answers may change how you see history itself. Have you ever wondered if John Wilkes Booth really acted alone? Textbooks often tell us the tale of one bitter actor striking down a president. But what if the truth was bigger, darker, and more organized than we imagine? Scott Ellsworth's new 2025 book Midnight on the Potomac argues exactly that, and his claim could rewrite what we think we know about Lincoln's last night. So, was the assassination just one man's madness, or was it the tip of a Confederate iceberg? Stick around, because by the end of this section, you might see Booth's gunshot in a very different light. Let's begin with the official version we all grew up with. John Wilkes Booth, a famous stage actor, furious over the Confederacy's defeat, plotted revenge. With a handful of friends, he hatched a desperate plan to kill Lincoln, Vice President Andrew Johnson, and Secretary of State William Seward. Booth carried out his part, while Lewis Powell stabbed Seward, and George Atzerodt lost his nerve. The story has been repeated for generations, and it paints Booth as a lone wolf surrounded by bumbling accomplices. But Ellsworth says that version is too neat, too tidy, and far too small. What if Booth's act was not just personal rage, but part of a larger Confederate playbook? During the war, the Confederate Secret Service in Canada had funded schemes to burn New York, poison water supplies, and spread chaos behind Union lines. These weren't rumors. Documented cases exist of Confederate agents setting fires in northern hotels and trying to spread yellow fever. Booth moved in circles that knew of these plots. Could his strike at Ford's Theater have been another mission, meant not only to kill Lincoln, but to destabilize the Union at its moment of triumph? Ellsworth's research introduces letters and memoirs from lesser-known Confederate actors. These dusty papers, buried in private collections, describe whispered talk of coordinated actions. In one letter, an agent refers to a final blow that will unman the North. In another, there's mention of a star performer who would deliver a fatal note. You can guess who that star was. Now, are these smoking guns or just dramatic phrases? That's the historian's dilemma. Still, when you stack them with Booth's known connections to Richmond and to Confederate backers in Canada, the bigger picture grows harder to ignore. Booth himself hinted at a wider cause. In his final diary entries, written while fleeing, he raged about tyranny and Southern honor. He believed he had acted for a nation, not just himself. To him, Lincoln was not merely a man, but a symbol of oppression. Why would Booth use the language of armies and nations if this were only about personal spite? What do you think? Would a lone madman speak of himself as a soldier carrying out orders of history? The Union government, of course, wanted a simple story. By hanging a few conspirators and closing the book, they could present Lincoln's murder as a crime solved. To admit a wider Confederate hand would mean acknowledging that the rebellion still lived, even after Appomattox. And after 4 bloody years, the public demanded closure, not more fear. Could this explain why Booth's ties to larger networks faded from official memory? It's not proof, but it's a possibility worth considering. Take the kidnapping plot. Months before the shooting, Booth and his men schemed to snatch Lincoln and trade him for Confederate prisoners. The plan was bold, but it wasn't just dream talk. They gathered weapons, horses, and maps. Booth even scouted routes across the Potomac. And here's the key. Kidnapping was a strategy discussed in Confederate circles. Documents from Richmond mention the idea. So Booth wasn't inventing plots out of thin air. He was swimming in a sea of schemes. Doesn't that suggest he was part of something bigger? Then there's the timing. Why strike in April 1865? The war was all but over. Confederate armies were collapsing. Jefferson Davis was on the run. And yet, Booth chose this moment to act. Was it coincidence? Or was it a last-ditch order to strike a psychological blow? Ellsworth suggests that the assassination was meant as a symbolic final attack, to shake the North's victory celebration and perhaps even revive Southern resistance. If so, then Booth was no lone wolf. He was the last Confederate weapon. Critics push back, of course. They argue that Ellsworth's letters are ambiguous, that memoirs written years later can exaggerate. They say historians love to find conspiracies where none exist. After all, Booth was egotistical, reckless, and obsessed with fame. Do we really need a Confederate committee behind him when his own vanity was enough fuel? That's a fair point. But ask yourself this. If you were a desperate government watching your cause collapse, wouldn't you encourage any man willing to take a shot at the enemy's leader? Even if Booth's vanity lit the fire, others could have fanned the flames. Ellsworth's thesis doesn't erase what we already know. Booth pulled the trigger. His small circle carried knives and pistols. They failed in their wider strike. But the new evidence suggests they weren't acting in a vacuum. Instead, they may have been part of a larger landscape of Confederate sabotage. Booth was not just a rogue actor. He was an actor on a much bigger stage. And maybe that's the irony. He always wanted a role that would be remembered forever. Did he find it by becoming not only a murderer, but a soldier in the last secret battle of the war? So here's the open question for you. Was Booth truly alone, or was he the visible hand of an invisible network? The official records may never settle it. But thanks to Ellsworth's research, we now have reason to doubt the simple story. Later in this video, we'll explore other mysteries, like what happened to Booth's diary and why parts of it vanished. But for now, remember this. History often tells us what we want to hear. The real story may be stranger, darker, and harder to accept. Have you ever noticed how missing pages in a book make the whole story more mysterious? Now imagine that book belongs to John Wilkes Booth, the assassin of Abraham Lincoln. His diary, found in a swampy Virginia barn after he was shot, should have been a straightforward record. But it wasn't. Pages were missing. Who tore them out, and why? That simple question has haunted historians for more than 150 years. Today, new explanations are gaining ground. But do they solve the riddle, or just raise more suspicion? Stick around, because this puzzle has more twists than you might expect. Let's start with the facts. When Union soldiers killed Booth in April 1865, they searched his body. Among his possessions was a small red leather diary. Inside were entries he had scribbled during his desperate flight. They revealed his anger, his sense of mission, and his hope that history would vindicate him. But when investigators examined the diary, they noticed something odd. Several pages had been neatly cut out with a knife. Imagine finding your enemy's confession book, only to see chunks of it missing. That would raise eyebrows, wouldn't it? For years, critics claimed that Union officials had removed those pages. Why? The theory goes that Booth may have named names, linked higher-ups, or revealed orders that pointed to a larger conspiracy. If the government wanted a quick story, that Booth was just a rogue actor, they would have had every reason to silence inconvenient evidence. Does that sound far-fetched? Maybe. But think about this. In the fevered days after Lincoln's death, the nation wanted blood, not messy truths. Could the missing pages have been an intentional cleanup job? That idea gained steam in the 20th century. Writers pointed to how the diary wasn't presented in court during the trial of Booth's accomplices. When it was finally shown, the missing pages were obvious. Some even suggested that War Secretary Edwin Stanton himself ordered the edits. Stanton was a man of iron will, deeply concerned about stability. If Booth's diary hinted at wider Confederate ties, Stanton may have thought the truth too explosive for public eyes. And once a rumor like that begins, it's hard to shake. But here's where new scholarship changes the picture. In 2024 and 2025, fresh attention turned to Booth's diary thanks to the television buzz around Lincoln's manhunt. The National Park Service updated its material, and several historians published careful studies. Their conclusion? The missing pages may not be sinister at all. In fact, the likeliest culprit is Booth himself. Sounds anticlimactic, right? But the reasoning makes sense. Booth was on the run, crammed into barns, pine thickets, and safe houses. His diary was both a journal and a scrap pad. Scholars now argue that he may have torn out earlier pages simply to make room for his final dramatic writings. Remember, Booth was a performer, a man who loved speeches and statements. His last entries read like a manifesto. To give them space, he may have sacrificed less important earlier jottings. If true, the mystery isn't government tampering, but Booth's own vanity. What do you think? Plausible or too convenient? There's another wrinkle. Some experts point out that diaries in the 19th century often doubled as appointment books. People tore out pages once they were used or no longer relevant. Booth's diary, small and pocket-sized, may have contained theater notes or daily reminders. If he ripped those out later, it would explain the gaps without needing a conspiracy. After all, how many of us have tossed old pages from calendars or notebooks without a second thought? Still, not everyone buys the innocent explanation. Skeptics argue that the neat cuts in Booth's diary don't look like casual trimming. They look deliberate, as if someone wanted to erase very specific information. One missing section, they note, falls right when Booth was planning the kidnapping plot against Lincoln. Could that have included names of Confederate contacts, or even Northern sympathizers? If those names existed, removing them would protect powerful figures. That suspicion lingers, especially among those who see Stanton's heavy hand everywhere. So where does this leave us? On one hand, we have a plausible, mundane theory. Booth tore out the pages himself, either for space or out of habit. On the other, we have the tantalizing idea that the government censored the diary to cover up bigger truths. Which is right. Historians today lean toward the first, but the second refuses to die. And maybe that's the real point. When the nation loses a leader in such shocking fashion, every gap in the record feels loaded with meaning. Silence itself becomes suspicious. Think about it this way. If those pages ever surfaced, what would they show? Perhaps nothing more than a list of debts or stage rehearsals. Or perhaps something far more explosive, a record of conversations with Confederate agents. Or even proof that Booth saw himself as part of a national mission. Without the pages, we'll never know. That uncertainty is what fuels the mystery. Sometimes the power of missing evidence is greater than the evidence itself. Here's the twist. Even if Booth did remove the pages himself, the fact that we still question it tells us something about how Americans view power and trust. We suspect our leaders, we wonder about cover-ups, and we search for hidden hands. Booth's diary is just one small book, but its missing pages echo our deeper doubts. Was justice truly served in 1865, or was it shaped to fit a convenient story? That's the haunting question, and it keeps the diary alive in our imagination. So what's the final answer? As of 2025, most experts say Booth himself probably removed the pages. But as long as the cuts remain, so too will the suspicions. And maybe that's fitting. Booth wanted to be remembered, and thanks to his missing pages, he always will be. Later in this video, we'll move from the diary to an even stranger mystery, the disappearance of Lincoln's own brain after the autopsy. If you thought missing pages were strange, wait until you hear what happened to missing organs. Have you ever heard of a president's brain going missing? It sounds like the plot of a crime novel, but it's a real mystery tied to Abraham Lincoln. After the assassin's bullet struck him in 1865, doctors performed an autopsy. They removed his brain, studied the wound, and recorded their findings. Yet somehow, that brain vanished. No one knows exactly when, or why, or where it went. How could something so important simply disappear? Stick around, because this strange tale will make you question how history is preserved or lost. Let's begin with the night of April 14th, 1865. Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater and carried to a boarding house across the street. He lingered through the night, but never regained consciousness. At 7:22 a.m., April 15th, he died. Hours later, government doctors performed an autopsy in the White House. Their goal was simple: confirm the path of the bullet. They located the round, lodged behind his right eye, and preserved parts of his brain for further study. At the time, that was common practice. Pathologists often saved tissue for teaching and research. But here's the problem. No one kept a clear record of what happened next. We know some material went to the Army Medical Museum, today's National Museum of Health and Medicine. The museum held thousands of Civil War specimens, from amputated limbs to bullet fragments. Lincoln's tissue was supposed to be among them. But when historians looked for it later, they found gaps. No signed chain of custody exists, no logbook confirms its arrival. The most important specimen in American history seems to have slipped through the cracks. How does that happen? Could it really be an accident? For decades, rumors spread. Some whispered that officials removed the brain to hide details of the wound. Maybe they didn't want the public to know how badly Lincoln's head had been damaged. Others suggested a darker twist, that a souvenir hunter stole it. During the Civil War, relic hunting was common. Locks of Lincoln's hair were snipped and saved. Even bits of his blood-soaked clothing were collected. Is it really unthinkable that someone might pocket the president's brain? But the most intriguing theory points to Robert Todd Lincoln, Abraham's only surviving son. Robert was a man obsessed with protecting his father's dignity. He guarded the Lincoln name carefully, even burning personal papers he thought too private. Some believe Robert may have ordered the brain quietly removed from public view. To him, the idea of his father's remains sitting in a medical museum might have seemed grotesque. Could Robert have arranged a quiet disposal? If so, it would explain the missing trail, though no evidence directly proves it. In 2025, the Allen County Public Library hosted a special program on this very topic. Scholars gathered to review what we do and don't know. A recent essay for the Friends of the Lincoln Collection laid out the facts plainly. There is no documented transfer, no surviving specimen, and no final account. The essay stressed that the absence of evidence does not prove a conspiracy. It may simply prove carelessness. But as you and I know, when it comes to Lincoln, mysteries rarely stay small. They grow. Here's another twist. Parts of Lincoln's brain were definitely examined during the autopsy. Dr. Edward Curtis, who performed the exam, described how the bullet tunnel destroyed tissue. He wrote about it in detail. So we know the brain was handled, photographed, and measured. Yet Curtis never mentions what was done with the actual specimen afterward. Was it bottled? Was it burned? Was it shipped to the museum and later misplaced? The silence is deafening. Imagine if we had that sample today, what modern science could reveal. Now, some skeptics say we're making too much of nothing. In the chaos after Lincoln's death, mistakes happened. Paperwork was sloppy, labels got lost, and shipments vanished. After all, the Army Medical Museum housed tens of thousands of Civil War specimens. Some were bound to disappear. Why should Lincoln's brain be any different? But ask yourself this. If you were in charge of preserving the remains of America's martyred president, would you really misplace them like a box of bandages? Doesn't that stretch belief? And then there's the cultural side. In Victorian America, fascination with death and relics was enormous. People bought mourning jewelry containing hair, visited public dissections, and even collected bits of famous people's belongings. Against that backdrop, the idea of Lincoln's brain being stolen isn't absurd at all. It almost seems predictable. If people fought over his stovepipe hat, why wouldn't someone covet the very organ that made him immortal in history? So where does this leave us? We have three main possibilities. First, the brain was lost due to poor record-keeping. Second, Robert Todd Lincoln intervened to protect family honor. Third, it was stolen, perhaps by a doctor or collector. Which theory seems most convincing to you? Personally, I lean toward Robert. He was known for his secrecy, and he had both the motive and the influence. But without proof, we can only speculate. Here's the irony. Lincoln's speeches, his words, his ideas, they've been preserved more carefully than his very brain. The mind that wrote the Gettysburg Address is gone, not only in death, but in body. Maybe that's the strangest lesson. We cling to relics, yet sometimes the most precious pieces slip away. Does that make us careless as a nation, or does it show that memory itself matters more than flesh? What do you think? The missing brain mystery remains unsolved, and maybe it always will. But its absence fuels our fascination. When something so important vanishes, we can't help but wonder who had a hand in it. Later in this video, we'll turn to another bizarre chapter, the repeated openings of Lincoln's coffin. If the missing brain sounds unsettling, wait until you hear how many times his grave was disturbed. How many times should a president's coffin be opened? Once at most, right? Yet Abraham Lincoln's coffin was opened not once, not twice, but multiple times over the decades. Each opening carried its own story, fear of grave robbers, family doubts, and public rumor. Why did Lincoln's remains face such repeated disturbance? And what secrets, if any, were discovered inside? Stay with me, because this tale of coffin secrets might be the strangest Lincoln mystery of all. Let's start with the year 1876. 11 years after the assassination, America was celebrating its centennial. But in Springfield, Illinois, a gang of counterfeiters hatched a plan to steal Lincoln's body. Their scheme? Snatch the coffin from its tomb, hold it for ransom, and demand the release of a fellow counterfeiter from prison. It sounds like fiction, but it was real. On the night of November 7th, the gang crept into Oak Ridge Cemetery with saws and tools. They even managed to lift the marble lid. But before they could remove the coffin, detectives and Secret Service agents pounced. The plot failed, but it sparked a question. If they tried once, what would stop others? In the aftermath, Lincoln's friends and family grew anxious. Mary Todd Lincoln was still alive, and she insisted on protecting her husband's remains. Trusted allies quietly moved the coffin to a hidden spot inside the tomb. Imagine that, a president's body tucked away in a secret corner, hidden behind lumber and bricks. Few people knew the location. For years, Lincoln lay in near anonymity, guarded not by marble monuments, but by secrecy. Do you think that was fitting for a man of his stature, or a sad commentary on the risks of fame? The story didn't end there. By 1887, officials decided to encase Lincoln in a steel cage, buried in 10 feet of cement. The logic was simple. If robbers wanted him, they'd need dynamite. When workers opened the coffin to move him, a small group of witnesses peeked inside. To their astonishment, Lincoln's body was remarkably preserved. His hair, beard, and even features were still recognizable. The embalming had worked better than anyone expected. The sight left some speechless, others shaken. Can you imagine gazing into the face of Lincoln more than 20 years after his death? But rumors continued to swirl. Some skeptics claimed Lincoln's body wasn't really in the coffin at all. They whispered that during the chaos after the assassination, the corpse had been switched, stolen, or lost. The whispers grew so persistent that in 1901, Robert Todd Lincoln, ever the guardian of family honor, ordered one final opening. This time, there would be no doubt. On September 26th, a group of witnesses, 23 in all, filed past as workers lifted the coffin lid. What they saw silenced every rumor. There was Lincoln, still recognizable, though darkened by time. His features, though faded, confirmed the truth. The body was indeed his. Robert then commanded that his father's coffin be permanently sealed. Workers lowered it into a massive steel cage, poured thousands of pounds of cement, and left it buried deep in the tomb. From that day forward, Lincoln's rest was finally secure. Or so we think. But doesn't it strike you as remarkable that even in death, Lincoln's body seemed to face the same turmoil he endured in life? Plots, secrecy, doubt, and ultimately a search for certainty. Why did people care so much? Part of it was respect. Lincoln wasn't just a president. He was a martyr, a symbol of union and freedom. To desecrate his body would have been a crime against memory itself. But another part was curiosity. Americans in the 19th century had a fascination with death and the macabre. Stories of opened coffins, preserved bodies, and ghostly remains captured the public imagination. Lincoln's coffin became not just a burial site, but a stage for legend. The repeated openings also reflect something about America's struggle with closure. Lincoln's death was more than personal. It symbolized the nation's pain after the Civil War. Maybe people needed to see his body, again and again, as if to prove he was truly gone. Only then could the country move forward. What do you think? Was this about security or about healing a national wound? Even today, the tale sparks debate. Some historians argue the openings were necessary, practical, and responsible. Others see them as ghoulish intrusions. But one fact is certain. Lincoln's coffin became one of the most closely guarded relics in American history. No other president has faced such repeated scrutiny after death. Washington's tomb was never disturbed. Jefferson's grave was left alone. Only Lincoln endured this strange cycle of doubt and verification. Here's the irony. Lincoln often spoke of a new birth of freedom. Yet in death, he was denied a peaceful burial, pulled back to the surface again and again by fear, greed, and rumor. Each opening revealed not only his face, but also the unease of a nation unsure how to protect its most sacred symbols. That unease lasted until 1901, when Robert finally forced permanence with cement and steel. It took 36 years to give Lincoln the rest he deserved. So the next time you think of Lincoln lying in state, imagine instead the hidden tombs, the secret moves, the counterfeiters' saws, and the witnesses staring into his coffin decades later. His grave was not just a resting place. It was a battlefield where memory, rumor, and respect clashed. Have you ever noticed how conspirators often meet unusual ends? In the case of Abraham Lincoln's assassination, this pattern is striking. John Wilkes Booth died in a Virginia barn, shot and hunted like an animal. But what about the others? His accomplices, Powell Atzerodt, Harold, Surratt, and more faced justice, but their fates were not simple. Some were executed, some imprisoned, some later freed, and some shrouded in rumors that never faded. Did their deaths silence deeper truths? Or were they simply the grim end of desperate men? Let's dig into the strange destinies of Booth's circle. The government moved fast. Within weeks of Lincoln's murder, military authorities rounded up suspects. On July 7, 1865, just 3 months later, four conspirators swung from the gallows: Lewis Powell, David Harold, George Atzerodt, and Mary Surratt. The hangings were public, witnessed by soldiers, reporters, and officials. Yet even in that grim moment, controversy brewed. Many believed Mary Surratt, the first woman executed by the federal government, was more victim than villain. Her boarding house had been used for plotting, but evidence of her personal role was thin. Did the government hang her to send a message, or to bury inconvenient questions about who else she might implicate? That doubt has never fully gone away. Lewis Powell, sometimes called Lewis Payne, had attempted to kill Secretary of State William Seward the same night Booth shot Lincoln. Powell stormed into Seward's home with a knife, slashing and stabbing, leaving Seward and several others badly wounded. At his execution, Powell appeared calm, even resigned, though he was just 21 years old. Witnesses said he declared loyalty to the South until the end. Was Powell simply a fanatic soldier following orders, or did he know of deeper connections? His silence in the last moments leaves us wondering. David Harold, Booth's companion in flight, was little more than a follower. Many described him as weak-minded, easily led. Yet he died the same way as the others, swinging from the rope. Some questioned whether executing such a small player made sense. But in the atmosphere of 1865, mercy was rare. Every conspirator represented the chaos of rebellion, and the government wanted finality. Still, think about it. If Harold was truly as feeble as described, might he have known more than he let slip? Did fear keep him quiet? George Atzerodt had been assigned to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson, but he lost his nerve and never tried. At his trial, he came across as cowardly and confused. Yet he too was hanged, treated as equal to those who struck. Was his execution justice, or was it meant to ensure no loose ends remained? By silencing him, authorities avoided the risk of a nervous man spilling secrets later. Mary Surratt's death remains the most debated. Many pleaded for clemency, even some members of the jury. But President Andrew Johnson refused. She kept the nest that hatched the egg, he said, and so she died. In the years since, historians have argued over her guilt. Some believe she was fully aware of Booth's plots. Others see her as a scapegoat, condemned for her associations rather than her actions. What do you think? Was she a conspirator, or was she sacrificed to show no mercy would be spared? Not all the conspirators died on the gallows. Samuel Mudd, the doctor who set Booth's broken leg, was sentenced to life in prison at Fort Jefferson in Florida. He always claimed innocence, insisting he had no idea Booth had just killed the president. In prison, Mudd tended to yellow fever victims, saving lives. For that, he was pardoned in 1869. Yet his name remained tainted for generations. His name is Mudd became a popular phrase, a cruel legacy. Was he truly guilty, or another man swept up in the government's desire to punish? Then there was John Surratt, Mary's son. Unlike the others, he fled the country. He joined the papal Zouaves in Italy, fought under the Pope's army, and was eventually captured. His 1867 trial ended in a hung jury, and he walked free. He lived until 1916, giving occasional lectures about his past. But his freedom raises a question. If he knew so much, why wasn't he silenced like the others? Did he avoid the rope because by then the nation was too weary for more blood? Or was it because his testimony might have exposed details best left hidden? The pattern is hard to ignore. Some conspirators died swiftly, almost too swiftly, before deeper questions could be asked. Others were imprisoned far from public eyes. And those who survived carried scars of rumor and suspicion. Was this simply justice, or was it also control, ensuring no one could broaden the circle of blame beyond Booth's small band? Remember, in the weeks after the assassination, panic gripped Washington. Rumors flew of wider Confederate plots, of Northern sympathizers, even of foreign involvement. The public needed closure, and the government needed stability. Executions delivered both. But at what cost? Did they also bury the chance of a fuller truth? When you silence conspirators, you silence potential revelations. Perhaps that was the point.